Hello everybody, and welcome to this video, which is kindly sponsored by Squarespace.
And today we're creating an entirely new album from scratch. So first we're going into the archive section, and we're going to put in the title, HMS Glorious Interwar Period, because that's what the pictures we're going to have are. Then we're putting in a non-linked web page, so this is one that won't show up on searches, but is a separate page on your site. Then I'm going to add an image gallery, and remove the default images. 1, 2, 3, 4. And then upload my images. Then, of course, change the aspect ratio, number of columns. So we're going to go with 16 by 9 in 2 columns, which gives you a good view of the photos themselves. They obviously, if you click on them, will expand. We can play around with the spacing between them. I'm going to choose a spacing of 20 because that's quite nice. And once that's done, you can see a whole load of photos taken either of or from HMS Glorious during her interwar service career. A lot of them focusing on aircraft that perhaps crashed or when the ship itself crashed at one point. But with that done, head back to the archive page, go to link, select the Glorious page, and that is literally it. That's how easy it is to create a nice little album in Squarespace. Then we just click on it once we've saved the page, and look, it works.
So if after all these little mini tutorials I've been doing, you think you could build a website for maybe ideally naval history purposes, but you never know, you might want to do it for some other reason, then head over to squarespace.com/Drakenfell. You can get a free trial, and once you're ready, that little link will give you 10% off your first website or domain. So thanks once again to Squarespace for sponsoring the video, and on with the main show.
So a little over a month ago at the time of this video's release, you saw me go aboard USS Turner Joy in Puget Sound in Washington State, the northwestern part of the continental United States. However, that's not the only thing you can go and see in the area, even if you're not part of the US Navy. Now, just off to the left behind that fenced-off area, you can see the actual start of the Bremerton-Puget Sound Navy Yard. But this is the sail of USS Parch, SSN 683, which is reputed to be the most highly decorated vessel in US history, or at least it was. You can see all the decorations there on the side. They donated the submarine sail to the Puget Sound Naval Museum. So it's quite a distinctive marker that lets you know that you've reached said museum, and it is a 3-4 minute walk away from the Turner Joy. So you've got 2 different things to visit if you happen to be in the area. It's a relatively small museum, but it has a large variety of rather interesting naval artifacts, a lot of them obviously related to the shipyard right next door. So let's go and have a look. One of the first things you'll encounter is this rather wonderful collection of brass, copper and wood, and you might be thinking, what on earth is that? Is that some kind of scale model of a fuel pump or something? Well, no. This is for the hopefully unthinkable, but occasionally thinkable. This is actually a fire alarm system, but a very complicated one for the time period. This is a fire alarm system from the beginning of the 20th century. So obviously these days, if you have a house, you probably should have a fire alarm of some description, but a house is relatively small. So the fact there is a fire and thus a fire alarm going off is enough to tell you what you need to do. For a very large installation like a warehouse or, I don't know, a shipyard, you might have multiple points where you could set off the fire alarm. And then nowadays you'd have an electronic dashboard that would say, hey, this area is saying there's a fire. Back in the 1900s, they didn't have that, but they did have this. So what you can see coming in on either side are in fact little telegraph lines. So all through the shipyard, there were notification points which you could press or pull levers to say, hey, there's a fire here. And thanks to the wonderful, essentially purely mechanical functionality of this, so there's a little bit of electronic functionality, of course, because of the telegraph lines, this device would not only record the time at which the alarm was raised and sound the overall shipyard whistle, telling everyone, hey, there's a rather big problem, we should probably deal with this, but it would also send out an alert code to tell the firefighting staff or the firefighters nearby, hey, we need someone to go and put a fire out. And it recorded where the fire was, as in which alarm had been set, which is quite a lot of clever automation for something which, as I say, works on a minimum amount of electronic signal and is mostly just a mechanical calculator, and in a relatively compact package as well. And right next to it is this. This is actually a fully functional steam engine from the 19th century. No one seems to be sure exactly how deep into the 19th century it goes, but given it's got wooden cladding on the cylinders, probably a relatively early one. But this thing was dug up in a non-functional state at some point in the mid-20th century, and then the machinist apprentice class of 1958 at the Shipyard decided to restore it. So they manufactured the replacement parts, put it all together, made it work, and now it sits as quite a happy and interesting museum piece. Something of this size and scale would potentially have been the engine for perhaps a ship's steam launch or something like that. Now, the history of Puget Sound Naval Shipyard, sometimes called Bremerton Yard, but it's actually Puget Sound Naval Shipyard in Bremerton, goes back quite a way as far as US Navy facilities are concerned. It's obviously not quite as old as Gosport Navy Yard that went on to become Newport over on the East Coast, but immediately after the conclusion of the American Civil War, it was noticed, of course, that Puget Sound has very sheltered but very deep natural harbours, and that this might be of interest to the US Navy. The first recommendations were made to establish a shipyard here in 1867. Those weren't followed up because, as regular viewers of the channel will know, in the immediate aftermath of the American Civil War, Congress did its level best attempt to kill the US Navy, an attempt only really surmounted by the very first US Congress's idea that the US didn't need a navy at all. And so it wasn't actually until 1891 when the USN started to build up again with its first pre-dreadnought battleships and armoured cruisers that for the low price of just under $10,000, 190 acres was acquired. That obviously grew in the subsequent years, and the yard now covers about 340 acres. The original intent of the yard was to be both a shipbuilding and ship repair and overhaul yard, but its use has evolved continuously throughout the 20th century. About 10 years after the shipyard was first opened, it took on its first apprentices. At that point, the apprenticeship was strictly what today you'd almost call an internship, although they were paid a certain amount. It was on-the-job training. It wouldn't be until 1914 that an official apprentice school with an academic study program and specific lines of work was opened at the yard, and at that point they offered 4 different apprenticeship programs. You could become a machinist, a shipwright, a boat builder, or a draftsman. Now, although the shipyard could build vessels, and indeed did so during its first few decades, it was primarily an overhaul and repair yard. That changed as World War I broke out in Europe, and in 1916, with the US Navy looking at major expansion thanks to a number of acts passed by Congress in that year, the shipyard's primary mission was revised from overhaul and repair work to battleship construction, of all things. And the next year, the US entered World War I, which put a little bit more pressure on the US's shipbuilding capabilities, and the US Navy decided, well, we're actually going to expand the yard's shipbuilding capabilities beyond what even we were going to do in 1916. And that involved a number of things: new cranes, some additional land purchase, because as we mentioned, the shipyard did grow several times, and the construction of what in the yard is known as dry dock number 3, a shallow dry dock that is quite large. But thanks to the requirements of the First World War, Puget Sound didn't actually lay down any battleships during the war, instead completing almost 2,000 small craft, submarine chasers, tugs, minesweepers, and boats for the most part. All of this requiring an almost 4.5 times increase in the workforce for the duration of hostilities. The interwar period saw the yard construct some of its largest dedicated warships, with the Northampton-class USS Louisville and the New Orleans-class USS Astoria both built there between 1928 and 1933, although overhauls of much larger ships were still conducted, and in 1933, in order to aid in that, The rather massive hammerhead crane with a 250-ton lifting capacity was built at the yard in 1933 and remains pretty much the single largest thing that you can see, at least height-wise. Much of the rest of the 1930s was spent building a variety of destroyers, and this activity would continue through World War II, with a number of Fletcher-class destroyers being built here, along with a number of the Evarts-class destroyer escorts. But although Dry Dock Number 3 was very large, it was 926 feet long, with a depth of only 23 feet, it could linearly fit anything the US Navy had built up till that point, but you would have to rather severely lighten some of the bigger ships for them to get in depth-wise. And so in the run-up to World War II, 2 new dry docks, 4 and 5, were started, which were both a little bit larger. Dry Dock 4 is about 997 foot long, and Dry Dock 5 is 1,030 foot long. They're both also slightly wider at 147 feet, and they have a 45-foot draft, which allows a ship of any description, even an Iowa, to be pushed into the dry dock fully loaded and dealt with, although obviously you wouldn't normally want to do that. There would be a 6th dry dock added in the Cold War period, which is even larger, which can fit any sized nuclear carrier that's been built so far, but that's a bit beyond the scope of the channel, but it does exist. But again, in the run-up to and during the US's involvement in World War II, the shipyard's primary role was actually repair and overhaul once more. Rather famously, 5 of the 6 battleships that survived the Pearl Harbor attacks but needed refit work to one degree or another were all sent to Puget Sound for that work, that being Tennessee and Maryland, both not massively damaged, but the somewhat more substantially damaged Nevada, California, and West Virginia also found their way to Puget Sound for overhaul, repair, and modernization. And funnily enough, in the latter part of 1941, HMS Warspite, fresh out of being damaged in the Mediterranean, was also present at Puget Sound, being refitted, and she was actually there when the Pearl Harbor attacks happened, which leads to the rather interesting alternate history counterfactual of if the Japanese had been suicidal enough to actually try attacking the US West Coast, either at the same time or immediately after the Pearl Harbor attacks, it would have been Warspite's job as one of the few operational capital ships on the US West Coast to help try and repel said attack. And then pushing a little bit past the period the channel normally covers, but it provides a nice little bookend for covering the Puget Sound yard as far as this video is concerned. In the immediate aftermath of World War II, the poor workers there must have felt a little bit like yo-yos, because their initial job was helping with Operation Magic Carpet as they turned various ships into troop transports, or close to, in order to bring various soldiers, sailors, etc. back home from the Western Pacific and Europe. Then they had to deactivate massive numbers of Pacific Fleet vessels, and then a few years later they had to massively reactivate huge numbers of those vessels once the Korean War broke out, and then they had to deactivate a bunch of them after the Korean War finished. And then they had to reactivate a bunch of them in the 1950s when people realized actually this whole Cold War thing definitely is a thing, in the midst of which they were also building a couple of the early guided missile frigates. And Puget Sound was a hub of carrier conversion as well, because of course things like angled flight decks and steam catapults were now all the rage, and so a succession of Essex-class aircraft carriers came in for a variety of progressive conversions to varying degrees of angled flight deck usage. The shipyard also converted USS Coral Sea, one of the Midway class, from her through-deck setup to an angled flight deck in the late 1950s. And while shipbuilding would continue at Puget Sound well into the 1960s, with, for example, the USS Seattle, a fast combat support ship, being built in the late 1960s there, the yard was undergoing a little bit of a conversion as the advent of the nuclear age saw the yard turned into one of the major refit, overhaul, and latterly decommissioning yards for nuclear-powered vessels, as well as continuing to support the refit, overhaul, and maintenance of conventionally powered vessels. and also playing host to one of the larger detachments of the reserve fleet, as well as storing some vessels that are eventually destined for the scrapyard. And all of this history and more is told on the first floor of the museum through various artifacts like this. This is a capstan head from very early on in Puget Sound's history, through to a typical toolbox of a shipyard worker circa just after the end of the Second World War. And look, there's even some really nice classic goggles there. Some of the tools you may even recognise from your own garages, sheds and workshops, although obviously there is something of a lack of power tools. The rather wonderfully named USS Pyro has its bell preserved here. And just in case you thought people naming US Navy ships had no sense of humour, Pyro was the first in a long line of ammunition ships. They've also got artifacts associated with the construction of very specific vessels. So this is the builder's form for one of the submarines that was built at the yard. And if you take a closer look when you're at the museum, you can see each of the lines has markings as well as numbers and measurements, because they could use this as essentially a scale model from which to construct the submarine's hull. And back in the day, before calculators and computers as we would understand them, they had things like this, a very complicated calculating instrument that comes with its own set of instructions, and this would rather shorten the number of calculations or the time taken to do said calculations when they were trying to transform drawings or small 3D models like we just saw into full-sized parts for ships. A classic diving helmet, because of course when you have a ship in dry dock you do need to send divers down to check on various things like is she actually over the blocks properly and so forth before you actually start draining the dry dock. If you just stick a ship in, hope for the best and drain the dry dock, that can lead to some rather unfortunate consequences. And there's even bits of various ships. This is, as the label says, a little bit of shrapnel from USS Tennessee that was taken off of the ship during her refit in the post-Pearl Harbor period. And while you can get a fairly decent idea of what the overall shipyard layout is like from the shoreline, because the shipyard sits in an inlet and you can actually just drive around to the other side and look across, that is, of course, a surface level view. If you want a somewhat more bird's eye view of the total layout of the yard and, well, you don't happen to work there, they also have a rather nice large scale model of the shipyard. Or at least the shipyard as it existed circa World War II, for those of you worried about operational security. I don't think anyone is going to be quite that concerned about the precise location of an Essex class aircraft carrier these days. And that's just a portion of downstairs. Upstairs, they have a whole section dedicated to PT boats, many of which were built or serviced in the area and their operations in the Pacific. They also have a section on carrier operations, because, well, they overhaul and convert and eventually decommission a whole ton of carriers. We won't go through those bits in this video because, well, you've got to go and see the museum. We don't want to show you absolutely everything. But there's also quite a nice haul on the ship's cranes. And of course, as the engineer in me was always going to want to go and have a look at the history of the cranes. And via a series of photos, and whoever was doing the photography at Puget Sound over the first half of the 20th century was really good with their camera, they managed to capture a whole series of the different types of cranes, either in use back then or in use still at the yard, as well as explain their various capabilities, capacities, and how they get around. So, for example, did you know that there are still around about a dozen cranes at the yard, but unlike some yards which will have the cranes fixed, or they might be on a little loop of track for a particular dry dock, Puget Sound actually has the whole yard connected up by a rail system. So all of their mobile cranes, like the ones you can see here, are actually capable of being relocated throughout the dockyard. So if there's a really intensive job that needs multiple cranes in one particular part of the yard, they can bring multiple cranes to bear. And if there's lots of ships in lots of portions of the yard that all individually need a bit of attention, then the cranes can also disperse, which is quite a useful feature, all things considered. It's also quite intriguing to see exactly how quickly the lifting capacity of these cranes developed. So, you know, at the start of the 20th century, in the late 1900s, early 1910s, you're looking at cranes that are lifting low double digits of tons. Not all of them. There were one or two bigger ones, but they're pretty substantial, you know, multi-supported cranes. And then by the 1930s, as we said, you've got the big hammerhead crane, and that thing is lifting 250 tons. And if you've seen various photos, I mean, lots of dockyard cranes have done various stunt photos, but some of the more impressive ones that you've seen over the course of this channel, and probably in your own research as well, were performed by the big crane that's now green, but that is at Puget Sound, because, well, when you've got 250-ton lifting capacity, you can lift not just one big heavy thing, but perhaps multiple big heavy things as well. And with that, we're going to wrap up our very quick look at some of what's available on offer at the Puget Sound Naval Museum. It's very definitely worth a good look round if you happen to find yourself over in that neck of the woods. And as I said, you can combine it, of course, with a look aboard USS Turner Joy. I did the two things on 2 separate days. You might be able to get both into one day if you start early, but I would probably take 2 days, because to enjoy both the museum and Turner Joy to their fullest extent, you probably want to be around for the majority of the opening time. And of course, you can always go and have a look at a few of the other attractions in Puget Sound and Bremerton as well, because it seems to be a fairly nice place. Absolutely glorious sunrises and sunsets. And the next time we revisit the September 2024 tour of the US, we're going to be over in Chicago for a look at U-505, the captured German submarine. See you then.